Prepare to dive into a forbidden love story that blossomed amidst the chaos of World War II. Jack, a young American soldier, and Greta, a brave German woman, found true love during one of the darkest periods in history. This sweeping and dangerous romance defied all odds, revealing that even in the most challenging circumstances, love can thrive. Join us on this thrilling journey of secret meetings, unbreakable promises, and unimaginable challenges, as Jack and Greta fight to keep the flame of their love alive. Don't miss this epic and inspiring story of courage and hope. During World War II, the world was in turmoil. Amidst the chaos, love stories flourished against all odds. This is the story of Jack, a young American soldier, and Greta, a courageous German woman, whose hearts intertwined during one of the darkest periods in history. Jack was part of the United States 101st Airborne Division. On the cold, dark night of June 6, 1944, also known as D-Day, he and his comrades parachuted over enemy territory. The mission was risky, and the soldiers knew there were no guarantees of return. The objective was crucial: to weaken German defenses before the Allied forces landed in Normandy. The landing was turbulent, and under enemy fire, Jack got separated from his unit. Panic and the chaos of battle surrounded him. At dawn, he found himself alone, wounded, and disoriented in a quiet village hidden among the hills and forests of Germany. His injuries were severe, but he knew he had to keep going. The distant sound of Nazi patrols made him seek refuge in a small stone house on the edge of the village. Cautiously, Jack approached the door and knocked softly. The door opened slowly, revealing Greta, a strong-spirited woman who worked as a nurse. Seeing the bloodied American soldier, she hesitated for a moment. Helping an enemy could mean death for both of them, but compassion overcame fear. Without a word, she led Jack inside, hiding him in the basement of the house. The first days were marked by silence and distrust. Jack, unable to communicate well in German, and Greta, with limited English, used gestures and glances to understand each other. While Greta tended to Jack's wounds, he couldn't help but admire her courage. She risked her life to help wounded soldiers, regardless of their side in the war. With each gentle touch and worried look, Jack felt something new and profound growing inside him. The nights were long and dangerous. The sound of distant bombings and nearby Nazi patrols constantly reminded them of the danger they were in. But in the refuge of the basement, a silent and powerful bond began to form between them. Jack told Greta about his life in America, his childhood memories, and his family waiting for him at home. Greta, in turn, talked about her childhood in Germany, her hopes, and dreams that the war had almost destroyed. Over time, mutual distrust gave way to a deeper understanding. Jack taught Greta some English words while she taught him German. They laughed at pronunciation mistakes and clumsy attempts to communicate. These nightly lessons became precious moments, a refuge of normalcy amid the war. One night, as the wind howled outside and the house felt especially isolated from the world, Greta brought a small radio to the basement. She turned it on, and by some miracle, they managed to tune into a station playing soft and melancholic music. The silence was broken by the melody, and for a moment, the war seemed distant. Jack reached out to Greta, and she, with a shy smile, accepted. They danced slowly in the small space, each movement a reminder that they were alive, together, and in love. The moments they spent together were intense and full of emotion. Between whispers and furtive glances, love began to blossom. They knew that what they felt was dangerous, but they couldn't deny the strength of their connection. The war around them only deepened their bond, as each moment together could be their last. Days turned into weeks, and despite the circumstances, Jack and Greta found small moments of joy. They picked wildflowers in the nearby fields, enjoyed the sunshine when it was safe, and delighted in small daily victories, such as getting more supplies or hearing good news about the Allied forces' advance. These fleeting moments of happiness strengthened their love even more. One afternoon, while Jack helped Greta wash clothes in the stream behind the house, he paused to admire the scene. Greta stood with her bare feet in the cold water, laughing as she splashed water on Jack. He couldn't believe that amidst a war, he had found something so beautiful and pure. It was at that moment that Jack realized he couldn't imagine his life without Greta. He knew he had to survive the war not just for himself but for her. The war continued to take its toll, and Jack knew his time with Greta was running out. He feared the day he would have to leave her to fulfill his duty. Each temporary farewell between him and Greta was painful, marked by uncertainty and fear of the unknown. Finally, the day came. Jack received orders to reunite with his unit for a crucial mission. The farewell was heartbreaking. Jack promised Greta that he would return to her, no matter how long it took. They exchanged vows of love and hope, and Jack left with a heavy heart, determined to keep his promise. Greta stayed behind, watching Jack disappear into the night. She knew that the war could separate them forever, but the hope and love they shared gave her the strength to carry on. Life in the village continued, but now with the shadow of uncertainty and constant waiting. The days that followed were tough for Greta. She kept herself busy with her work as a nurse, tending to the wounded who arrived from the front. Each face marked by pain and suffering reminded her of Jack and the danger he faced. But she also found strength in her memories, in the precious moments they shared, and in the promises they made to each other. The war continued, relentless and brutal. News of battles and losses arrived constantly, but Greta clung to the hope that Jack would return to her. Each letter she received, filled with words of love and longing, renewed her determination. She knew she needed to be strong, for herself and for the love they shared. While Jack was at the front, he also found strength in his memories of Greta. Amidst the horror and destruction, he clung to the moments of joy they shared. Each letter he received from Greta was a beacon of hope, a reminder of what he was fighting to protect. He promised himself that he would survive the war, not just for himself but for her. The days in the village were intense, but also full of tender moments between Jack and Greta. The war kept them apart for long periods, but when they managed to meet, the world seemed to stop, leaving only the love they shared. After the first meeting at Greta's house, Jack had to temporarily stay away to avoid raising suspicions. He took refuge in nearby forests, moving from place to place to avoid capture. But he always found a way to send a message to Greta, letting her know he was safe and would return. Greta, anxious and full of hope, awaited these messages with bated breath. One night, as the moon shone high in the sky, Jack finally returned. He appeared silently at the back door of Greta's house. She opened the door, and in an instant, they embraced tightly, as if trying to make up for the days of separation. In the silence of the night, Jack and Greta talked for hours. Jack recounted the dangers he had faced and the battles he had fought, while Greta shared her own experiences, caring for the wounded and keeping hope alive. They comforted each other, finding strength in the love they shared. As time passed, Jack and Greta found ways to see each other more frequently. Greta, who had access to medical supplies and less guarded locations, made excuses to go out at night. They met in an abandoned barn on the outskirts of the village, far from the prying eyes of Nazi soldiers. Each meeting was a mix of urgency and tenderness. They knew they were risking everything, but the love they felt was stronger than fear. The nights in the barn were magical. By the light of flickering candles, they exchanged passionate kisses and whispered promises. Jack taught Greta to speak English, while she taught him German. Their low laughter and affectionate glances filled the silence of the night. In one of these encounters, their passion became irresistible. The imminent danger and the intensity of their feelings made every moment together even more precious. On a particularly cold night, Jack brought a thick blanket to the barn. They snuggled under it, seeking warmth in each other's embrace. The desire they felt finally manifested. Jack kissed Greta with a tenderness that reflected all the admiration and respect he had for her. She responded with equal intensity, and soon they found themselves entwined in a dance of love and passion. It was a moment of pure connection, where the barriers imposed by war and fear disappeared, leaving only the love they shared. The months passed, and the secret meetings continued. Jack and Greta created a routine, each finding comfort and joy in these stolen moments from the war. However, life always has its surprises. Greta began to notice changes in her body. At first, she thought it was just the stress of the war, but it soon became clear that she was pregnant. The news brought a whirlwind of emotions. Greta felt a mixture of fear and happiness. She knew that the pregnancy would complicate things even further, but the thought of having Jack's child gave her hope. When she told him, on a cold night in the barn, Jack held her tight and promised he would always be by her side. Greta's pregnancy increased the risk of being discovered. She had to be even more careful, avoiding any behavior that might raise suspicion. Jack, in turn, became even more determined to protect Greta and the baby. He doubled his precautions, finding safer ways to communicate and plan their meetings. Despite the challenges, the meetings continued. Greta hid her growing belly under loose clothing, and Jack did his best to ensure her safety. Every moment together was precious, as they knew time was running out. The war still raged on, and the Allied troops were getting closer to liberating Germany. Jack knew the war wouldn't last forever, but the future was uncertain. He began to make plans for when the war would end. He promised Greta that as soon as peace was restored, he would return for her and the baby. They talked about what their life together would be like, far from the horrors of war, and this gave them the strength to carry on. The days of waiting became long and difficult. Greta continued to work at the hospital, hiding her pregnancy as best she could. Jack, on his missions, stayed focused, always with Greta and the future on his mind. The hope of a reunion after the war was what kept them strong. The bond between Jack and Greta grew stronger with each meeting. Despite the challenges and dangers, the love they shared was a light in the darkness of the war. Every kiss, every touch, every whispered word was a promise that, no matter what happened, they would always love each other. As the months passed, the Allied forces, led by the United States, intensified their offensives against the Nazi regime. In June 1944, D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Allied troops landed in Normandy, establishing a foothold in occupied France. This triggered a series of strategic victories that forced the German troops to retreat. The German resistance was fierce, but the Allied advance was relentless. Cities were liberated one by one, and the pressure on Berlin increased. In April 1945, Soviet forces approached the German capital from the east, while the Allies advanced from the west. Finally, on May 8, 1945, Germany signed the unconditional surrender, marking the end of World War II in Europe. With the Allies' victory, the war came to an end, but for Jack and Greta, the real challenge was just beginning. Jack received orders to return to the United States. The chaos of the post-war period meant that many soldiers were being quickly redeployed, and Jack didn't have time to properly plan his farewell. On their last night together, Jack and Greta met in the barn where they had shared so many special moments. Greta, now visibly pregnant, was desperate at the thought of being alone in a war-torn country. Jack, for his part, was tormented by guilt and fear of not being able to keep his promise to return to her and the baby. That night, the barn was enveloped in an atmosphere of sadness and uncertainty. Jack held Greta tightly, as if he could protect her from all adversities with his embrace alone. They exchanged words of love and whispered promises, trying to find solace in the fact that, despite everything, they still had each other. Jack caressed Greta's belly, feeling the slight movement of the baby. He promised Greta that he would find a way to come back to her, no matter how difficult it might be. With tears in her eyes, Greta vowed to wait for him, keeping hope alive in her heart. Before leaving, Jack gave Greta a locket that he always carried with him. Inside, there was a photo of him and a small piece of paper with the promise written, "I will come back to you and our child. Wait for me." Greta held the locket tightly, promising herself that she would take good care of Jack's gift and show it to their child when he was born. The journey back to the United States was agonizing for Jack. Amid the celebrations for victory, he felt empty and worried about Greta and the baby. The Atlantic crossing was long and full of uncertainties. Jack feared for the future, wondering if he would ever be able to keep his promise. The returning soldiers were welcomed as heroes, but Jack couldn't feel that way. His heart was divided between fulfilled duty and devastating longing. Upon arriving home, he was greeted by his family and friends, but the joy of reunion was overshadowed by Greta's absence in his life. As Jack tried to adjust to civilian life, Greta faced her own challenges in Germany. The country was in ruins, and daily life was a constant struggle for survival. Greta continued to work as a nurse, helping to rebuild the community and caring for other wounded. Greta's pregnancy progressed, and she worried about the baby's future. Jack's promise was her only source of hope. The locket he had left with her became her talisman, a symbol of love and the promise of a future together. The months passed, and the weight became unbearable for both of them. Jack, back in the United States, started looking for ways to return to Germany. He wrote letters to Greta, even though he knew the postal service was disorganized and many letters would not reach their destination. Greta, on the other hand, kept hope alive, though she missed Jack terribly. She faced daily challenges with courage, always remembering Jack's words and the promise he had made. Every movement of the baby in her womb was a constant reminder of the love they shared. The separation was a cruel test for Jack and Greta. Each day without news from each other increased the anguish and uncertainty. The war had ended, but the battle for their reunion and happiness was far from over. After months of anguish and separation, Jack was determined to fulfill the promise he had made to Greta. The end of the war brought a sense of relief, but also a cloud of uncertainties and challenges that seemed endless. While the soldiers returned home as heroes, Jack felt a weight in his heart, a deep desire to return to Greta and the child that awaited him. The battle against post-war bureaucracy and logistical difficulties was immense. Jack, now a civilian, worked in a factory and saved every penny. He searched for information on how to travel to Germany, facing a mountain of paperwork and processes, but his determination did not waver. Each passing day intensified his urgency to return to Greta, to see the face of the child he only knew through letters and the moments shared with the mother. Meanwhile, in Germany, life continued to be a challenge for Greta. The country was in ruins, and reconstruction was a monumental task. Greta, with her indomitable spirit, worked tirelessly as a nurse, caring for the wounded and helping to rebuild the community. Despite the hardships, she found solace in Jack's promise and the anticipation of his return. The pregnancy advanced, and Greta felt the imminent arrival of the baby. Every movement of the little being in her womb was a reminder of the love she and Jack shared. The medallion Jack had left her became her talisman, a symbol of hope and the promise of a future together. Greta always carried it with her, finding strength in the darkest moments. Time seemed to drag on as Jack struggled to gather the necessary resources for his trip. He sent letters to Greta whenever he could, even knowing that the postal service was disorganized and many letters might be lost. Greta, in turn, received these letters with a mix of joy and frustration, eagerly awaiting the day she could finally reunite with Jack. Finally, in a desperate effort, Jack managed to secure a visa and a passage to Germany. He boarded a ship to cross the Atlantic, his heart racing with the anticipation of the reunion. The journey was long and filled with uncertainties, but hope kept him firm. Each day at sea brought him closer to Greta and the child he had yet to meet. When Jack arrived in Germany, the scene was devastating. The cities were destroyed, and life was far from easy. He disembarked at a European port and began his journey to the village where Greta had lived. Crossing the devastated areas was a challenge, but Jack was determined to face any obstacle to reach the woman he loved. During the journey, Jack reflected on the months of separation and how much had changed. The war had left deep scars, but the love for Greta and the desire to build a future together gave him the strength needed to move forward. Finally, after days of traveling, Jack reached the village where Greta lived. He was anxious and nervous, and the hope of finding Greta drove him on. In the village, life continued in a grim and difficult manner, but Greta maintained her routine with immense determination. The day was cold and cloudy when Jack approached the small stone house. He stopped in front of the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The house was quiet, and Jack hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. Greta was in the kitchen, preparing a bit of food for herself. She was tired, but her spirit was still strong. When she heard the knock on the door, she didn't think much of it, imagining it could be a neighbor or someone from the village. Upon opening the door, she stood paralyzed for a moment, her eyes widening at the sight of Jack standing before her. Jack. The name left her lips in a stunned whisper. She blinked several times, trying to believe what she was seeing. Jack smiled with a mix of relief and emotion. "Greta, it's you. I've finally returned." The reunion was overwhelming. Greta and Jack embraced with an intensity that expressed all the pain and joy accumulated during the separation. Tears streamed down their faces, and the world around them seemed to disappear. The war, the hardships, and the challenges of the past no longer mattered in that moment. Only the love they shared mattered. After the initial moment of joy and relief, Jack and Greta entered the house, where the reality of the situation began to set in. Greta was visibly pregnant, and Jack felt a wave of emotion at seeing the concrete evidence of the future they had dreamed of together. They talked at length, sharing stories about what they had gone through and how life had shaped them during the months of separation. Greta prepared a simple meal for Jack, and as they ate, they discussed plans for the future. Jack was determined to find a way to establish a stable life for them, far from the shadows of the war. He knew that rebuilding would be a challenge, but he was willing to face any obstacle for Greta and the baby to come. The baby was due to arrive soon, and Greta was anxious for Jack to be present at the birth. She knew his presence would be a relief and a source of strength during the process. Jack, for his part, was prepared to assume his role as father and partner, dedicating himself to the future they were about to build together. Time passed quickly, and the arrival of the baby drew near. Greta and Jack spent their days preparing for the new phase of their lives. They organized the house, bought supplies, and prepared the baby's room. Each task was performed with a feeling of hope and anticipation, knowing they were about to start a new chapter in their lives. Finally, the night arrived. Greta began to feel the first contractions, and Jack was by her side, offering support and comfort. The room was lit only by the soft glow of candles, creating a calm and soothing atmosphere. Jack held Greta's hand, whispering words of encouragement and love. The labor was difficult, but Jack and Greta faced the experience with courage and determination. Jack stayed by Greta's side the entire time, helping her through the waves of pain and offering the support she needed. The night was long, but by dawn, the room was filled with joy and emotion. The baby was born healthy, and Greta and Jack were overwhelmed as they saw the face of the child they had awaited with so much hope. The baby's cry filled the room, a sound that seemed like a hymn of victory and renewal. Jack held the little one in his arms, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. He looked at Greta with an expression of admiration and joy. "He's perfect, Greta. We're finally complete," Jack said with a choked voice. Greta smiled through her tears, holding the baby with a tenderness that reflected the love she felt for him and Jack. "We did it, Jack. The dream we had is becoming a reality." The following days were filled with adjusting to their new lives as parents. Jack and Greta found a new routine, balancing the challenges of parenthood with the joy of finally being reunited. The house was filled with love and hope, and the future seemed brighter than ever. Despite the scars left by the war, Jack and Greta found a way to overcome the challenges and build a life together. The baby brought a new perspective to their lives, and they were determined to create an environment of love and security for him. The village began to recover from the wounds left by the war, and Jack and Greta became part of the reconstruction. They helped rebuild not only their own lives but also the community around them. Each day was a reminder that, despite the difficulties and separations, love and hope would always find a way to prevail. The future was full of promises and new opportunities. Jack and Greta were ready to face any challenge that came their way, knowing they had each other and their son to guide them. The war had been a trial, but the love they had shared and the life they had built together were proof that even in the darkest times, hope and happiness could bloom. And so, the story of Jack and Greta, marked by love and overcoming obstacles, found a happy and surprising ending. The war had left its marks, but the true love that had emerged amidst the chaos had triumphed. They were ready to face the future with the certainty that, together, they could conquer any challenge and build a life full of love and happiness.